All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Dr. Steve and Dr. Terry Zinn, in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zinn Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th yard site. Leah Sol as a schus refuah for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and for all the wounded in Eretz Yisrael. May our soldiers be safe and secure. Yonason and Rachel Wolf, for a complete and lasting refuah shlema for Rafael Yitzchak Baruch Ben Esther. Sherry and Sarah Wolaski, and discuss refuah shlema for their grandsons Zechariah Dov Ben Parol Shira. Ed and Iris Miller in the schus of the holy soldiers of the IDF and the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. And our week of learning sponsors, Joel Hasner, in thanks to the friends of the Israel Defense Forces who need our support in this difficult time. Also, yesterday's sponsorships, which I apologize I didn't have, our Daf Yomi sponsors for yesterday were Michael and Rachel Leibowitz, Le'ili Nishmas, Freda Chana Bas Moshe Aaron, and Ilan Roth, Le'ili Nishmas, his father, Yosef Ben Moshe, on the occasion of his 60th yard site. We hope then in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos will have an Aliyah, the families Ein Nechama, our holy soldiers should be successful in all of their missions, and our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael should Hashem remain safe and secure in the days ahead. With that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Samech Hey. Today's daf is 65. We are picking up on Samech Daled Amud Beis 64b, and we're picking up 4 lines up from before the lines get wide. So we have a lot to do today. Remember again, the Mishnah was speaking about the interesting case of a man who was Mekadesh his daughter. Right? So the way it worked is he was Mekadesh his daughter, and he had multiple daughters. He did not indicate ultimately again which daughter he was being Mekadesh. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara was talking about, so really there are 2 cases. In case number 1 is being Mekadesh's daughter Stam, right, just being Mekadesh's daughter. There he had older daughters and younger daughters. So the Gemara says the older daughters are not part of this. Why? Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, he doesn't have control over his Bogeres daughter. Therefore, the issue is the Ketana daughter. The Ketana daughter, which of the Ketana daughters was he Makadesh? Now, the Gemara then said that halacha l'maisa are actually only dealing with where there's one Bogeres, one Ketana. Where if there's only one Bogeres and one Ketana, then halacha l'maisa, what's the issue? What's the issue? In other words, there's only one Ketana. So the Gemara is asking, what's the case? Over here, the Shavise Shaliach. The case here, Rabbi says, where the father has 2 daughters, right? One a Bogeres, one a Ketana. But the Bogeres daughter, actually, we also remember we had this Gemara before. The Bogeres daughter made her father her Shaliach to accept Kiddushin on her behalf. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Ki makabel Kiddushin adaita didei kamakabel. Maybe when the father accepts Kiddushin, he's accepting Kiddushin on behalf of the adult daughter. Kamash malon lo shavik inish midi di isle hanomine va'avid midi the leslie hanomine. To which the Gemara answered, no, a person doesn't go ahead and forsake something or give up something from which they have hana in order to do something from which they don't have hana. Now, what does this mean? So remember that halacha l'maisa, when a father is mekadesh his kitana daughter, who gets the kesef kiddushin, who gets the money? It's the father. As opposed to when he's mekadesh his bogeres daughter, who gets the money? The girl. So therefore, again, bepashtos, when the father is going to be accepting kiddushin on behalf of someone, bepashtos, he's going to do it on behalf of the kitana daughter because he benefits from it. Milo askina and the first white line. Milo askina and the amr le kiddush shelach. Are we dealing with the case where maybe the Gedolah daughter said to her father, "Father, if you be my shaliach and you could keep the kesef kiddushin, afilu hachi lo shafik inish mitzvah deramya alei va'avid mitzvah de lo ramya alei." Nevertheless, I will say a person is not going to forsake a mitzvah that is incumbent upon him in order to perform one that is not incumbent upon him. So let's remember again when we had this Gemara before, we spoke about this idea that the father is vested with the biblical right, and maybe even one could say certain respects responsibility to mekadesh his ketana daughter. See, even if he's going to get money from both of these transactions, at the end of the day, he's not going to forsake something that is quote unquote a mitzvah. Mitzvah doesn't mean he has to do it. Mitzvah just means it's a biblical right given to him in order to do something that is not a biblical right given to him, but it's just stam shlichus. So I will say what comes out of the first case of the Mishnah is when a father has 2 daughters, one is a Bogeres, one is a Ketana. The Bogeres said to her father, "Dad, can you be my shaliach in order to accept Kiddushin for me?" The Ketana It's his right. He goes, he's Mekadesh his daughter. Right? What happens? Say, at the end of the day, it's not clear. It's not clear who he accepted Kiddushin for. So halacha l'maisa, we assume, the halacha says he accepted Kiddushin for the younger daughter. Why? Because since this is a mitzvah or a right that is given to him, therefore halacha l'maisa, we assume that is the right he exercised and not Kiddushin for the Bogeres daughter. Incredible. But let's go weiter. So Mishi yesh lo shtei kitim, on a second wide line on Samach Namba 64. So remember again, now we came into this interesting case of a man who has two sets of daughters. So in this case over here, what was happening was as follows. Reuven is married to two women, Rachel and Leah. He has two daughters from Rachel, two daughters from Leah. What happened? So remember again, the Mishnah gave two cases. In case number one, here's what he remembers. I was Makadesh, my older daughter. My elder daughter. So Rabbi says, remember what happened then? What happened then? We weren't sure what does older daughter mean? What does older daughter mean? Now remember, there are multiple variations which then led to a machlokes. Rabbi Yossi said that halacha, well, actually it's before Rabbi Yossi, Tanakama said that halacha l'maisa, essentially when he was Mekadesh his older daughter, every single one of the daughters is Safik Mikudeshes except the youngest of the youngest, right? Essentially, daughter number 4. Rabbi Yossi said, no, only the oldest of the oldest ultimately again is Mikudeshes. So we'll say they have the same exact machlokes when the father is Mekadesh his youngest daughter. So what does that mean? Same machlokes Tanakama Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, and I will say, now the obvious shaila is, why do you need both cases? In other words, they're both illustrating the same concept, right? Which is that Tanakama holds, we'll say, in other words, what's the fundamental machlokes? Tanakama holds that sometimes people make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Yossi holds people never make ambiguous statements. So therefore Tanakama will say, when a father says his oldest daughter, oldest could mean so many different things. Rabbi Yossi says, no it doesn't, it means the oldest of the oldest. Same thing with youngest. So why need to illustrate this halacha with both cases? If it would have just said the first case of the oldest daughter, Rabbi Meir is a Tanakama. Right? So ultimately, again, it's only in that first case that Rabbi Meir holds his position. Why? Because Lamaisa, anytime you have a younger sister, you're called an older sister. Aval Baha Ema Modi Rabbi Yossi Diktana Lahach Kitana Dekulu Karilu. But maybe in the case of the Kitana, maybe Rabbi Meir would agree with Rabbi Yossi that when it comes to the youngest daughter, the only girl called the youngest daughter is who? Mamish, the actual youngest. Be Itmar Baha, had it just said the same case of the youngest daughter, Baha come Rabbi Yossi, that's when Rabbi Yossi says that youngest, who knows what youngest means? But maybe in the case of the older daughter, he agrees with the Meir, therefore tzricha. So we'll say the bottom line is you need both cases. Fine. The memra. They both say, here we go. The memra. Rabbi Meir savar machis inish nafshi l'sveika. Rabbi Yossi savar lo machis inish l'sveika. So we'll say, so now what comes out of this Mishnah, and as I just mentioned before, the fundamental machlokes is, do people make ambiguous statements? Right, that's our fundamental machlokes. So now, based on the Mishnah, what you're saying is Rabbi Meir holds people do make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Meir is a Tanakama. People do make ambiguous statements, and Rabbi Yossi says people don't make ambiguous statements. Here's the problem: we see just the opposite. We see, in other words, we see opposite attribution. Where this now listen to this: Hanoder ad haPesach. So let's say a person makes a neder. I make a neder. I'm not going to eat the cake ad Pesach, up until Pesach. So what does up until Pesach mean? Aser ad shiagia. Okay, so ad Pesach means up until the start of Pesach. What happens if a person says ad sheyehei Pesach? I hereby take a neder not to eat cake until it will be Pesach. So aser ad sheyetze. So we'll say, so then it means you're offering cake unto yourself until when? Until Pesach is over. So Pesach ad sheyehei Pesach, until Pesach is over. Now. Ad Pnei Pesach. So we'll say, so now what happens if a person says, I won't eat cake ad Pnei Pesach. What does ad pnei Pesach mean? And I will say literally means until I see the face of Pesach. What does that mean? Rabbi Meir Omer Asr ad sheyagia. Rabbi Meir says it means up until the time that Pesach arrives. Rabbi Yossi Omer ad sheyetzi, until Pesach leaves. Now I will say, now watch what's happening over here. In that case, let's work backwards. Rabbi Yossi is saying until Pesach is over because Rabbi Yossi is not sure what does ad pnei Pesach mean. Does it mean up until the beginning of Pesach, up until the end of Pesach? So he errs on the side of caution, and then says up until the end of Pesach. Rabbi Meir says no, it means up until the beginning of Pesach. So what in this case, what do you see over here? Rabbi Meir is the one who says people don't make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Yossi says yes, they do. It's the exact opposite of our Mishnah. Don't worry about it. No, ultimately, again, switch around. The attribution in Nidarim is incorrect, and switch it around. Align the positions of the Mishnah and Nidarim, ultimately again with our Mishnah, and really it should be that when you say Ad Pnei Pesach, really Rabbi Yossi says up until Pesach, and Rabbi Meir says ultimately again until the end of Pesach. So there were Tanya, Kol Ze'aklal, Kol Shezmano Kavua, Va'amr Ad Pnei. Yet we learned in a Brisa. Anytime you have something that is fixed, a fixed event, and you use the lotion of Ad Pnei, like we just saw by Pesach, Rabbi Meir Omer Ad Sheyetze. Rabbi Meir says ultimately again until it's over. Rabbi Yossi Omer Ad Sheyageh. So we'll say this brisa, this V'atanya is being brought as a support to what we just said. Switch around the positions of Nidarim, namely in Nidarim and Ad Pnei. Rabbi Yossi will say up until the beginning. Rabbi Meir will say up until the end, because again, that aligns with our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says people do in fact make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Yossi says no, they don't. Amr Abaye. So we'll say so that's just understand, which is just also such a fascinating machlokes in just how people talk, right? Rabbi Yossi says people speak in a defined fashion. People say what they mean, and they don't use ambiguous or couch terms. Rabbi Meir says, what are you talking about? People do that all the time. People, I've mentioned this many times, Rav Pam, Father Shiva said, you know what the worst word in the English language is? The worst word? Whatchamacallit. Right? Why? He says, if a person is saying whatchamacallit, it means they have not fully thought through what they want to say. And a person should never say anything until they're 100% sure exactly what they want to say and how they want to say it. So that seems to be in line. It seems to be in line with Rabbi Yossi's position. People are defined and measured in what they say and how they say it. Rabbi Yossi says, no, they're not. So that's the machlokes. Here we go. We'll say, let's go back there. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, Amr Abaye says, we'll say second to last line, Samach Talam 64b. Amr Abaye, machlokes b'shtei kitei banos. The machlokes ultimately again is when you have two different sets of daughters. So we'll say, so remember again, the machlokes in our Mishnah, right? Reuben says, I was makadesh my older daughter, Biti Agdola, my oldest daughter, or my older daughter. So remember again, the shaila is, what does that mean? So the Gemara says that whole ambiguity is only when there are two sets of daughters. He's married to Rachel, he has two daughters from her. He's married to Leah, he has two sets of daughters from her. Aval, however, again, Abaye posits, Bekas Achos. Let's say Reuben only has one group of daughters. Let's say Reuben is married to Rachel. They have three daughters. Reuben says, I was Mekadesh, my older daughter. In that case, the Gemara says, Divrei Akol Kidola Mamish, Kitana Mamish, Emtsois Bishma Karila. In that case, also when there's one set of daughters, everyone agrees. Who's the oldest? The biological oldest. Who's the youngest? The biological youngest. And the middle daughter is referred to just as the middle daughter. So I'll say, so it's interesting. So the ambiguity only comes when you have two sets of daughters. But if you have just one set of daughters, then again, oldest means the oldest, youngest means the youngest. And again, if you're talking about the middle daughter, you'll be referring to her as middle daughter. Incredible. Elamiata, we'll say top of Samachay 65a. Elamiata, Emtsois Shebekas Shnia Tishtari. So I will say, if that's the case that halacha l'maisa, middle daughter, is always referred to as middle daughter, then even in the case of two sets of girls, ultimately, again, the middle daughter in the second set should ultimately be freed from any of this ambiguity, because bepashtos, she would be referred to as middle daughter. Hacham asking, and what's the case? B'she'ein shem ela gidola ukitana. I will say, the case that we're dealing with over here is not a case of three girls in each set, but rather, again, a case of just two girls in each set. So the Gemara says, b'she'ein shem ela gidola ukitana. V'achina, mistaber, this seems to be the case. The im isa, because ultimately, again, if there was actually a middle daughter involved over here, so the Gemara says, she should have been stated, and according to that logic, the middle daughter of the first set, ultimately, Rambam says she is under the specter of this suffix, right? Because remember, again, we're not sure, is she the Gidola, is she the Kitana? So the Gemara says, Mikatanila, is she mentioned explicitly? No. Haki hashta hasam, say first wide line, Samichem Aleph, 65a, Haki hashta hasam, Tana, Kitana dida liisura v'hua din lahach dikashisha mina. So we'll say the way that the Mishnah is written is ultimately, again, the kitana of that group is aser, and the one who is older than her is under the cloud of this ambiguity as well. Hacha im isa diika nisne. But in our case over here, if there really was a middle sister, she should have been mentioned more explicitly. Amali Rav Huna b'rid Rav Yoshua l'Rava ha Pesach dichi kat achas dami upligi. Here we'll say the Pesach case, we said before by Nedarim, is the equivalent of having one group of children, and yet again we see that Allah said there is still the Machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. They both say by the Pesach case, they both say that was the case of Ad Pnei Pesach. A person makes an edit, I won't eat cake until Ad Pnei Pesach. What does that mean? So both say that's a machlokes in something else. Hasam belishna da'ama kamiflagi. Both say that's just a machlokes in verbiage. Mar savar ad pnei Pesach ad kamei Pesach. One opinion says ad pnei Pesach means up until the arrival of Pesach. Umar savar ad mifnei Pesach. And the other opinion says no, it means until the end of Pesach. Good. So both say, so bottom line, I will say, how do we paskin in this case? So in general, in this case over here, where let's say again you have Reuven, let's focus on the court case in the Mishnah, where you have Reuven going ahead. You have Reuven going ahead and saying, I was Mekadesh my older daughter or my younger daughter. And the case in the Mishnah is he has two wives, Rachel and Leah, let's say 3 daughters with each. So what is the halakha? So we'll say the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yossi. Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yossi that people make definitive statements. And therefore halacha l'maisa, when a father was Mekadesh his older daughter means the oldest daughter. She is the only one who is Mikudashas, the rest are not. When he says my younger daughter, younger means youngest daughter, and the rest, there's no suffix regarding it. And that's how the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yossi. Incredible. We'll say a very tremendous Musar Haskell for us also about how to be careful with how we speak. Right? That Rabbi Yossi is modeling for us that when we speak, we should be measured, and when we speak, we should be precise. So, if you think about it in relationships, how often is friction created because people make open-ended statements, right? Or people make ambiguous statements. In life, it is so much better just to say what you mean, to say how you feel, and to be directed in your words. Try to eliminate ambiguity from how you speak. Try to eliminate the whatchamacallit factor from how we speak. We should only speak when we know what we want to say and how we want to say it. And especially when interacting with our loved ones, we should try to speak in a way that doesn't leave our words open to interpretation, especially negative interpretation, but rather what we speak should be a clear conveyance of how we feel and what we truly mean to convey. Incredible. Says the Mishnah, listen to this case. Right? Reuven goes over to Rachel. Right? Reuven says, Rachel, I was Mekadesh you. V'hi omeres lo kidashtani. She says, no, you didn't. Shtickle awkward. So the Gemara says, "Hu aser b'krovo sal, v'hi muteres b'krovav." So it's an interesting case. So I will say he is not permitted to marry her relatives, but she is permitted to marry his. And I will say, this Rashi points out over here, this is the concept. Look at Rashi. Rashi is a little bit further down on the page. Hu aser b'krovo sal, tishavinu alei chaticha di'isura b'hodasa. So I will say, this is, we've seen this concept many times throughout Shas, shavye anafshe chaticha di'isura. We'll say, sometimes I make a statement, and halacha l'maisa, my statement by itself is not enough to create realities for other people. But who is it enough to create realities for? for me. So if Reuven goes over to Rachel, he says, I was Mekadesh you. And Rachel says, no, you were not, right? So remember, they're not married. They're obviously retired. There's no eidos. They're not married. However, because he said that he married Rachel, therefore what? He is usher to marry any of Rachel's relatives. So he can't marry Rachel's mother, can't marry Rachel's sister, can't marry Rachel's daughter. Okay, but she, on the other hand, Rachel, is free and clear. So she could accept Kiddushin from his brother, from his father, from his son, and there's no problem. Similar case, Hilmar's Kiddashtani. She says, right, Rachel is over to Reuven, you're Mekadesh me. V'omer lo Kiddashtich. He says, nope. Hu mutar b'krovosah. So same was just the opposite case. He is permitted to marry her relatives. V'asur b'krovav. But she is not permitted to marry his relatives. Third case, Kiddashtich. Reuven says to Rachel, I was Mekadesh you. V'omer, no, lo kiddasht ela biti. No, sorry, you might get a little bit confused. People say like I look like my daughter all the time. But, right, you weren't Mekadesh me, you were Mekadesh my daughter. You were Mekadesh my daughter. So what's the halacha? Who aser bikrovos gedola? So remember, now he's persistent. He says, no, I wasn't Mekadesh your daughter, I was Mekadesh you. So we'll say once again, he is not permitted to marry her relatives. Who aser bikrovos gedola? Uketol mutaras bikrovav. She, Rachel, is permitted to marry his relatives. Who mutar bikrovos kitana? He is permitted to marry the relatives of the kitana. Kitana, now I will say the Kitana is permitted to marry the relatives of Reuven, right? Because the Kitana, remember again, is not making any counterclaim. Next, Kidash tes biteich. Reuven says to Rachel, Rachel was Mekadesh your daughter. V'omeres lo kidasht ela osi. Rachel says, no, you were Mekadesh your daughter, you were Mekadesh me. Who asa bikrovos Kitana? He is not permitted to marry any of the relatives of the Kitana. Ukitana mutaras bikrovah, but the Kitana is permitted to marry his relatives. Who mutar bikrovos Gidola? He's permitted to marry Rachel's relatives. Ugidola asa bikrovav, but Rachel is prohibited to marry his relatives. So we'll say, so again, all of these cases, I was going to ask, all of these cases are the same, right? So bottom line, when someone makes a claim that they're married to someone else, remember again, that claim by itself does not create the halachic reality. Why? Because it's just one person saying something, right? There's no eidos, there's nothing else. So l'maisa, the only thing that claim does allow for is shavi anafshe chaticha di isura. At the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, you prohibit yourself ultimately to the relatives of the woman whom you are claiming you are married. And again, the reverse case works as well. If a woman claims that she's married to a particular man, doesn't create Kiddushin, but does prohibit her to the relatives of the man she claims she is married to. I asked the Gemara, the Avi's Kasha Utzricha, why do I need all these cases? Why do I need all of these cases? See, here we go, says the Gemara. Utzricha, the all needed, the Ashmoinan Gabe Didei. Let's listen to this. I would say, halacha l'maisa, right? When ultimately, again, when Reuven says, Reuven goes over to Rachel and he says, listen, I was Mekadesh you. Rachel says, no, you were not. So what's the halacha? So he is prohibited to her relatives. She is not prohibited to his relatives. So I need that case. Why? Listen to this. This is great. Sometimes guys just get married, right? In other words, that it could just happen that lamaisa again lo ichpas. Look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, "Gabe didei kiamar kidashtich lo misra'ihi bikravav mishum di'ihu shakuri mishaker v'gavra lo ichpas le'im oser asma bikravosei achinam." But say sometimes men lie about this stuff. Apparently, they'll just claim that they were married to someone. They weren't really married to someone. Rabbi say for one simple reason. Why? Because this is going to sound strange, it doesn't impact the man so much, right? Why doesn't it impact the man so much? He can marry more than one wife. Okay, so he's going to be usher to the relatives of this woman. Fine, right? There's more. What is it? There's more fish in the sea. More fish in the sea, right? So it's fine. So he'll be usher to relatives, but fine. So therefore, by a man, you could see why we would not take this statement so seriously to prohibit the woman as well. However, when a woman makes the claim, right, the woman says that you are Mekadesh me, we'll say that's much more significant. That's much more significant. A claim like that, like the stakes are very high for a claim like that. We would think, therefore, by definition, a woman would never say that, unless, of course, it's true. And therefore, when she makes that claim, not only should she become prohibited to his relatives, but he should become prohibited to her relatives. Kamash Malon. Women sometimes make untrue statements as well. right? That's the kamash malan. Sometimes that a man might be flippant in this. I would say, do not comment on this. I see the cross conversation happening, right? So sometimes, right? So ultimately, again, sometimes the statements will be made as well. Sometimes everybody makes flippant statements that aren't actually truthful. Good. Let's go back there. Next, kidashtich liyomeres hasulam. So why do I need the next case? So the Gemara says hasulam liitzrich sadai tamina midarais hemene rachman alaav midrabane. So we'll say. Remember, the next case was Reuven claims that it was Mekadesh Rachel. Rachel says, you weren't Mekadesh, you were Mekadesh my daughter. So we'll say, so listen to this. I would have thought as follows. Since Midarai, so the Torah gives a father the ability to Mekadesh his daughter, I might have thought Midrabanan him nuah l'didei, v'tissar barta b'dibura. I might have thought that maybe Midrabanan we believe a mother to say that her daughter is Mikudashas. Kamash Mala, no, we don't. Kamash, we don't. Okay. Kidash des biteich. Hasul. What do I need this next case? So remember again, this is where Reuven says, I was Mekadesh your daughter. Rachel says, no, you were Mekadesh me. So what's halach? Hasul amali. I did the tanaha, tananamiha. Once we quoted the first case of the daughter, we quote the second case of the daughter as well. Okay. So bottom line, all of the cases are necessary because each of them has their own nuance difference. But bottom line, they're all operating on the same halachic principle, which is when you create isser for yourself, you create a new reality for you, but that new reality cannot impact anyone else. Good. Now, this opens up another interesting point over here. So the Gemara says as follows. Itmar, Rav Amar Kofin, Ushmuel Amar Mavakshin. Rav says we force Reuven to give a get, and Shmuel says we request from Reuven to give a get. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about over here? Ahiyah, which case is this going on? Ilema Aresha, if you want to say it's the Resha, so Rabbi say Lav Kofinika, Velo Mavakshinika. Now remember, the Resha case is where Reuven goes over to Rachel. This is Rachel, we're married. Rachel says, no, we're not. Shabbos say, what's the impact of Reuven's statement on Rachel? What's the impact of Reuven's statement on Rachel? 0. Remember, the impact is on Reuven because Reuven says Reuven can't marry her relatives, but there's no vestige of marriage over here. So there's no forcing him to give a get. There's no requesting of him to give a get. There's no get. Ella as-seifa. So I'll say maybe it's on a seifa. So bishlam of actions. I understand. Ultimately, again, we request. And I both say the Sefer Rashi says over here, the Amra Kidashtani de Baigez. So both say the Sefer they're referring to is really case number 2. Where ultimately again, Rachel says to Reuven, you are Mekadesh me. You are Mekadesh me. So the Mishnah says, in a case where Rachel claims you are Mekadesh, and Reuven says, no, I wasn't. So remember again, I both say, what did the Mishnah say? What's the impact of that statement? Rachel says to Reuven, you married me. Reuven says, no, I didn't. What's the impact on Rachel on that statement? What's the impact? She's usher to his relatives. He's not usher to. So now the Gemara introduces. Now the Gemara says, by the way, Rav says in that case we force Reuven to give her a get. Shmuel says we request from Reuven to give her a get. So the Gemara says, so bishlam mavak shelichayis. I understand you could request from him to give her a get. Elakofin amai, but I don't understand. How can you force Reuven? Reuven's claiming I never married her, right? I never married her. So how can you force Reuven to give her a get in that situation? Amar lo necha le itzar b'krevei. And I both say, now you say to yourself, Reuven, what's the big deal? Just give her a get. Reuven says, no, it is a big deal because the truth is I've been dating her sister. So like if I give her a get, then what? I become prohibited in her relatives, to her relatives. So Lamaisa, it's not just stam, just give her a get. There's a ramification for that. Ella shmaisa hadadi itmar. Rather, Rabbi kind of collapse these statements together. How so? Amar Shmuel mevakshin mimena litain get. So Shmuel says, Rabbi, in this case, where Rachel comes along and Rachel says like this, right? Rachel says, Reuven, you married me. Reuven says, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. So now we'll say, what's the halacha? So first of all, the core halacha is, she is prohibited to his relatives, he is not prohibited to her relatives. But, now there's a follow-up. What's the but? Shmuel says, we request from him to give her a get. Look, you've got a lady claiming, Rachel's claiming that she's married to Reuven. Reuven said, I don't know what you're talking about. I never met you before in my life. Right? So now we ask Reuven, okay, maybe just give her a get. That way that just erases any vestige, any possibility that something's going on over here. So Amarav, in Nasan get me asmo, kofin osolitin ksuvo. Oh, listen now, watch this. So Shmuel says, we request a get. Rav says, by the way, if he gives a get of his own volition without being asked, then we force him to give a ksuva. Now, what's the pshat with that? What's the pshat? Because Rachel's claiming we're married, Reuven's claiming no, we're not. But then Reuven just says, I'll just give you a get. If Reuven gives her a get of his own volition, kind of what does that indicate to us? Something's probably happened over here. So if you gave her a get of your own volition without being asked, then we're going to force you to give a ksuva as well. Incredible. Seif Marnami. So the Rabbi says, Amarav Acha Bar Adam Amarav, Amrile Amarav Acha Bar Adam Amarav Hamnuna Amarav, Kofin Umevakshin. We force and we request. So the Gemara says, Tarti, I understand, how does that work? Kofin Umevakshin. So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar Mevakshin Mimeno Litain Get. We ultimately ask him to give a get, because again, that just erases any possibility of anything happening over here. However, again, if you went ahead and gave it of your own volition, it's mostly interesting, right? So in other words, if he doesn't give a get of his own volition, we ask him to do so. Now, if he refuses, what do we do? Nothing. We ask him. If, however, he gave a get of his own volition without being asked, so that tells us that maybe there's a little something going on over here, and therefore, we'd force him to give ksura. We'll say, if you look at that phrase, kofinum of action, we'll say it's such a good phrase in our avodas Hashem, right? That how does a yid kind of go ahead and approach his service to Kadosh Baruch Hu? Kofinum of action. We'll say you have to approach one's relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's kfiyah. There's an element of compulsion. We're soldiers, right? There's kafalim har kigigis. Kadosh Baruch Hu suspended the mountain over us. There's a sense of duty. It's a sense of duty, and I will say, because he has to start with a sense of duty, because if my relationship with Hashem is just because I want to, what's the problem with that? What's the problem? What happens when I wake up one morning and I just simply don't want to? So there has to be an element of compulsion in my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's kofin. Umevakshin. But then ultimately, again, there's a part of me that wants to do it because I want to do it as well. There's a bikosh. But kfiyah, the sense of duty, the sense of commitment, the sense of obligation, that has to come first, and then ultimately, again, the mevakshin, the willingness to commit, that ultimately comes after. I'm Rav Yehuda. Hamekadish be'ed echad in choshesh in the Kiddushin. So I will say, so now, remember all of these cases, right? The beauty or the fascinating part of all of these cases is there's no edus, right? The Mishnah is operating in a case where one party, right, says, you married me, right? Reuven says, I was married you. Rachel says, you married me. So again, essentially the overarching principle is shavye nafshei chaticha disura. Person could create a state of isser for themselves. Fine. Now we've also seen that halacha l'maisa, when Rachel says, you married me, we request from Reuven to give her a get, just to be done with it. Reuven gives a get of his own volition, then without being asked, that tells us there's something going on over here, we force him to give a ksuva. Next case, Amar Yehuda, hamekadish be'ed echad. It's an interesting case. What happens if a person, right, Reuven is mekadish Rachel, in the presence of an eid echad, one witness. What's the impact of being mekadesh a woman in the presence of an eid echad? So what's the halacha? In choshesh and the Kiddushin, Rabbi Yehuda says it's meaningless. It's meaningless. In other words, eid echad is the same thing as doing Kiddushin in front of no one. There's no impact to an eid echad. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, fine, Morash we'll catch up later. So Gemara says, Ein choshesh in the Kiddushin. B'abnei Rabbi Yehuda, shnei emodim mai. Wow, listen to this. What about the following case? Reuven and Rachel, right, both admit that they are married to each other. It sounds like a strange case. Like, everything is fine, there's no problem over here. Yeah, no problem. Right? Reuven says we're married, maybe even happily. Right? Rachel says we're married, most probably happily. Right? And then what happens? And the Eid Echad says, yes, they're married. So you have husband and wife agreeing that they're married, and the Eid Echad backing up this claim. Is that enough halachically to tell us that there is a valid marriage in front of us? So what's the halacha? So they asked Rabbi Yehuda this question. So in velo v'rafya biyadei. So sometimes Rabbi Yehuda said yes, sometimes Rabbi Yehuda said no. He wasn't clear about the halacha. He wasn't clear. Say itmar. So say let's analyze this for ourselves. Rashi says over here, in velo, lahaya machzik b'dvarav lo le'isr velo leheter, pam sha'amar hein, upamim sha'amar lav, v'rafya biyadei velo haisa muchzekes hora azu biyado. Wasn't sure. Sometimes he said yes, sometimes he said no, he wasn't sure. Itmar amrav Nachman amar Shmuel, hamekadish be'ed echad ein choshesh and lekidushin. If Reuven is mekadish Rachel in the presence of an eid echad, ultimately, again, we're not choshesh for the kiddushin. The Gemara says, va'afilu shneihem modin. And even if both of them admit, so both say, so now the Gemara is making a definitive statement that an eid echad by kiddushin, even when both Reuven and Rachel admit, so to speak, that they are married, it still doesn't work. Still doesn't work. So the Gemara says, Eis ve'are is a kasha to this. Eis Rav Nachman, Rav Kasha Rav Nachman, ha'omer le'isha kidashtich. Back to our Mishnah. Reuven says to Rachel, I was mekadesh you. V'yomer lo kidashtani. She says, no, you didn't. So what does the Mishnah say? Hu asa b'kravosav, himut has b'kravav. He is prohibited to her relatives, but she's permitted his relatives. Now, let's analyze this. V'idi ika edim. Now, if there are witnesses here, amai mutaris b'kravav. So then, of course, we'll say, if there are witnesses, then why would she be permitted to his relatives? V'idaleka edim, if there are no witnesses, amai asa b'kravav. So we'll say, if there's no witnesses, then why should he be prohibited to her relatives? Rather, it must be elalav be'eid echad. It must be that halacha l'maisa, there's an eid echad. There's an eid echad. So you see from here that an eid echad does work to some degree. To which the Gemara says, no, hachama askinu, what's the case? Kigon da amarla kidashtich bifnei ploni uploni, right? Bifnei ploni uploni uploni. I'm sorry, bifnei ploni uploni. B'halchu lahem lemedinas hayam. Interesting about saying. The Gemara suggests that the case of the Mishnah is where Reuven says to Rachel, I married you, and I was mekadesh you in the presence of two witnesses. Those witnesses are no longer here. Right, they went overseas. So therefore, I'm going to say there's no eidos involved in the case of the Mishnah. So both say so again. So therefore, remember, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're focused on a simple case. Reuven and Rachel both claim they are married to each other. The only corroboration of their statement is an eid echad. That is the eid echad in this case, where you have the agreement of husband and wife. Does that create a halachic marriage or not? So Eisi Gemara's kasha was an interesting case. Hamagarish ishto. They both say, watch this case. Reuven and Rachel were married. Reuven and Rachel got divorced. Then what happens? Velona ima bapundiki. Reuven and Rachel stayed in the same hotel one night. After they were divorced. So it says, what's the shaila? So Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maisa, they don't require a get sheni. I will say, now what's at play over here is, did they have relations? Right? And if they have relations, essentially we look at those relations as a second act of Kiddushin. Now remember again, a couple that gets divorced can get remarried as long as what? The wife has not married anyone else in the interim. So I will say, so now they were married, they got divorced, now they're sleeping in the same place. So now I will say, so the shaila is, do we assume that they were intimate with one another, thereby affecting another act of Kiddushin? So Beis Shammai says no. Shammai says no, there's no need for a second get. We assume that ultimately, again, there was no bia for the sake of Kiddushin. Shimon says no, we have to assume that ultimately, again, they were intimate with each other, and that bia was for the sake of affecting Kiddushin. They both say they could choose to stay married. When Beis Hillel says they need another get, what Beis Hillel says is if they want to mazel tov, they could definitely stay married, but lamaisa, should they want to go on and marry other people, would require a second guess. Hey chidami, what's the case over here? If ultimately again there's witnesses, my time Beis Shammai. So how did Beis Shammai say they don't need another get? And if there are no witnesses, my time Beis Hillel. What's Beis Hillel's logic? Elalav be'eid echad. So therefore, it must be that what? It must be that halacha l'maisa. It must be halacha l'maisa that there is only one witness. U'letamech. And using that logic, so the Gemara says, Ema seifa umodim beniskarsha mina erusin. Ultimately, again, everyone agrees that when they are divorced from erusin, that there is no need for a second get. Why? Now, both says it's interesting. The only time where we are concerned or we're choshesh that they were intimate with each other is when they had a previous intimate relationship. Now, again, a husband and a wife only live together after nisuin. So if you have a case ultimately again where they were divorced from erusin, which means they never lived together previously, then there's no reason to assume that they were intimate with each other this time as well. But if you think that Eid Echad is believed, Mali Min Eris and Mali Min Anisuin, who cares if they got divorced from Eris or from Nisuin? There's an Eid Echad, that should be enough to say that another marriage occurred over here. What's the case? Interesting. Veleka Edebia. Both in the case of here, Reuben was married to Rachel. They got divorced. Now they're alone together in the same hotel room. So now both say, so what's the shaila? Now we don't have any eidos that anything happened. All we have is eidos is that they were alone with each other. So we'll say, so what does that mean effectively? Now both say, I just want to point out over here, it sounds like there's something illicit. There's nothing illicit that's happening over here, right? In other words, the shaila just is like, do we assume the fact that they were alone with each other means that there was bia, and therefore against second kiddushin? That's the shaila. So Rabbi Shammai says, we'll say Abed Beis lo amrinon hein ede yichud hein ede bia. So we'll say, here we go. So Rabbi Shammai says we do not say that edus for yichud is the equivalent of edus for bia. So therefore, even though we have witnesses that say they were absolutely alone with each other, that's not tantamount to saying that there was bia. So we'll say second line on 65b. Beis Savri Aminon Hein Ede Yichud Hein Ede Bia. Beis says no. We do say that ultimately again the same eidos for Yichud is the same eidos for Bia. Okay. Umodim Vaday Ben Eskashim Min Eirisin Delo Aminon Hein Ede Yichud Hein Ede Bia Mipnei Shein Levagasa. I will say, but we do say halacha l'maisa. We will say that if they got divorced from Eirisin, then ultimately everyone agrees that Ede Yichud is not Eidei Bia. So therefore, I will say, it turns out that this case actually has nothing to do with our topic, right? So again, this is a totally separate machlokes. That do we say that Eidei Yichud, if you have witnesses that are formally, right, a divorced couple were alone with each other, do you say that testimony about yichud, their seclusion with each other, is effectively testimony about bia or not? That's the machlokes Beis Beis Hillel. But everyone agrees that if they were divorced from irisin, meaning there was no previous intimate relationship, everyone agrees that edei yichud is not edei bia. Now I will say, so that's fascinating, but not at all helpful for our case at hand. Remember, what's our case at hand? Reuven and Rachel come before us. They say we're married to each other. All we have is an Eid Echad who corroborates their statement. Is an Eid Echad, together with a man and woman who say they're married to each other, is that enough to create a halachic reality of a married couple? So one goes right. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Silber to Mishmei Derav Hamekadish Be'ed Echad in Choshishin LeKiddushin Va'afilu Shneihem Odin. Okay, so both says in our Yisrael Parshval said the name of Rav, a definitive statement. If Reuven and Rachel ultimately say they're married, and all they could produce is an Eid Echad, irrelevant or not halachically relevant or not halachically sound. Amar Rabba Barafuna Hamekadish Be'ed Echad Beidina Rabba Omri in Choshishin LeKiddushin. So listen to this. Rabba Barafuna said, if a man is Mekadesh a woman Be'ed Echad, the great Beis Din said the Kiddushin is not valid. Man Beidina Rabba. I will say, who is the great Beis Din? So the Gemara says, my Beidina Rabba, Rav. It's Rav. Ve'ike da'amri Amar Rabba Barafuna Amar Rav Hamekadish Be'ed Echad Beidina Rabba Amri Ein Choshishin LeKiddushin. So also just an alternate version of this. Man is the Kaddish woman with the Eid Echad. The great Beis Din said the Kiddushin is not valid. Man Beidina Rabba. Ultimately, again, who is the great Beis Din? Rebbe. Okay, so we'll say two versions, but the good news is both versions are saying the same exact thing, which is that if a man is mekadesh a woman ultimately again with an Eid Echad, again the chap is even if both of them are admitting is the wrong word, both of them are claiming we are in fact married to each other, halacha l'maisa, that kiddushin is not halachically sound or valid. Incredible. So Masev Rav Achtabai Bar Ami, so we'll say so Rav Achtabai Bar Ami raises a kasha, Shnayim Sheba Medina Sayam. Listen to this, it's a great case. Listen to this case. Right? Three people come, right? Three people come from overseas. Ruvain, Shimon, and Rachel. Okay, now watch this. V'chavila imam. And I want to say there's a package of goods. Metaltalin, movable property along with them. Now watch this. Ze omer, zo ishti, v'ze avdi, v'zo chavilasi. Now listen to this. Ruvain claims, this lady, Rachel, she's my wife. That guy, Shimon, he's my servant. That package, it's mine. V'zeh omer, zo ishti, v'zo avdi, v'zeh chavilasi. But it sounds like kaparas. Zeh kaparasi, zeh chalafasi, zeh chavarad, zeh atani lo yelech lemisa. So it says, listen to this. So now you have counterclaims, right? Reuven's claiming, Rachel's my wife, Shimon's my servant, the package is mine. Shimon is claiming, Rachel's my wife, Reuven's my servant, and the package is mine. Now get ready for this. V'isha omeres, this is great. Rachel claims, Elu shnei avadai. Reuven and Shimon are both my servants. V'chavila shali, and the package is mine. So says, great, right? Show up, right? Can you imagine you're in Beis Din that day? You get this case like, I should have slept in, right? So I'll say, so what do we do over here? So what do we do with this case? Tzricha shnei gittin. Shabbos says, so now in this case, Rachel's going to require 2 gittin, right? She's going to require a get from Reuven, a get ultimately again from Shimon. V'govek ksuvasa min chavila. It's interesting, and she collects her ksuva from the package. So essentially, she's going to require a get from both of them because both are claiming that she is their wife, right? Ultimately, again, but once there's a marriage, so to speak, she's entitled to a ksuva. She'll collect her ksuva ultimately again from the package that they are holding. Rashi says over here. Look at Rashi, Tzricha Shnei Gittin. Rashi says, almost right across in Tosas, Amar Lo. So Rashi says, K'dei likbos ksuvasa min hachavila, kilomar the olam hachavila munachas at shava elio. That was saying, now, in reality, the package is maman amutal b'safek, which means money that we don't know who the owner is. So whenever you have money that you don't know who the owner is, what do you do? No one can produce testimony, right? It's ultimately munach at shava elio. You kind of leave it. You just leave it. No one could claim it. So, however, if they give her a get, if both of them give her a get, then Allah she could collect her ksuva from the package. Now, say, what's the case? So we'll say, if both Reuven and Shimon have witnesses who say that halacha l'maisa, what? That halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, that they have witnessed, they have testimony that they married her. Then does Rachel have the ability to make a claim that both of these guys are my servants and the package is mine? Rather, Rabbi say it must be that what? We must be talking about over here a case of an eid echad. Take a case of an eid echad. V'tizbara, I don't understand. So let's say each of them are producing an eid echad. What does that do? V'tizbara, eid echad ba'achosha mi mehemen. Let's say if you contradict an eid echad. In other words, even if you want to say an eid echad is believed somehow, some way, that's only if what? That's only if the testimony of the eid echad is not contradicted. But if somebody is contradicting the testimony of the eid echad, then why would the eid echad have any believability, any credibility? So the Gemara says, "V'tizbara eid echad ba'achosha mi mehemen ela lemishri la'alma." So we'll say, rather, we're trying to figure out over here, halacha l'maisa, how does Rachel kind of emerge from this situation? Because remember again, what you have over here is Reuven claiming Rachel is his wife, Shimon claiming Rachel is his wife. So we'll say, what's the halacha? So we'll say, so ultimately again, everyone's going to agree that Rachel is not bound to either of these individuals. So the Gemara says, V'hacha haki kamar. This is what it means to say. Tzricha shnei gittin kedei ligbos ksuvasa min hachavila. So I will say, in reality, Rachel doesn't need a get. Right? Rachel doesn't need a get. Rachel doesn't need anything. She is permitted. If Rachel wants to collect her ksuva, so to speak, from that package, then she's going to require a get both from Reuven as well as from Shimon. Rabbi Meir, and it's reflexive view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, metaltali mishtabdi l'ksuva. Now, we'll say, now in general, by the way, the fact that she could collect the ksuva from movable property is interesting, because in general, the lien against ksuva initially devolves upon real property. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that the lien of ksuva devolves even upon movable property, and therefore, technically speaking, when Reuven and Shimon make this claim against Rachel, she doesn't need anything from them. However, if she wants to collect her ksuva from this package, then she's going to require a get from both of them. Okay, fascinating. So the Gemara says, "My havyala." All right, both say. The Gemara says, let's stay on task over here, right? In other words, we have a simple question. Well, it's not so simple, but we have a simple question. Reuven and Rachel are agreeing that they're married to each other. There's no machlokes over here. The problem is the only corroboration of this fact is an Eid Echad. So does corroboration through an Eid Echad, does that affect reality or not? My Havi Allah. So what is the bottom line? So Rav Kahana Amar in Choshesh in the Kiddushin. Rav Kahana says no, an Eid Echad Rabbi say doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything. Rav Papa Amar Chosh in the Kiddushin. Rav Papa says we are Choshesh for Kiddushin. We are Choshesh for Kiddushin. Armali Rav Ashi the Rav Kahana. My daitech. So Rav Ashi says Rav Kahana, right? Why is it that you say that we're not Choshesh for Kiddushin with an Eid Echad? So the Yalf is davar mimaman. So maybe you'll say like this. Where do we learn? I will say why. This goes back to the beginning of Kiddushin. I will say. How do you know that Kiddushin needs Eidos? Davar from mammon, right? I will say again. We equate Kiddushin with monetary matters. Just like monetary matters need what? 2 witnesses to create halachic reality, so too Kiddushin requires 2 witnesses to create halachic reality. Say if you have 1 witness, even though husband and wife are admitting that they're married, halachah said that is not enough. So Rav Kahana, is that your logic? Is that your logic? Well, if that's the case, imal la'alan hodas baldin kamei edim dami afkan hodas baldin kamei edim dami. But 1 second, okay, if you want to make a gzera shava of davar from marriage to mammon, and you're going to say just like Mammon requires 2 witnesses in order to affect reality, so too by Kiddushin, you need 2 witnesses to affect reality. But 1 second. By Mammon, Rabbi say even fasting halacha, which is what? Hadas baldin kamei edim. If I walk over to Reuben, I say, Reuben, I owe you $1,000. Rabbi say, what's the impact of that statement? What's the impact of that statement? I owe him $1,000. Hodas baldin, in other words, admission is like 1,000 witnesses. If that's the case, then why not go ahead and say the same thing by Kiddushin? So therefore, I will say, if both Reuven and Rachel are admitting that they are married to each other, then ultimately, again, that's Hodas baldin, and that should create a reality as well. Amrlei. Rav Kahana says, no, that's not a fair statement. Hasam lo kachayev la'achrini, hacha kachayev la'achrini. I will say, interestingly enough, if I admit that I owe Reuven $1,000, that statement is believed. Why? Because it doesn't have an impact on anyone else. Lamaisa, when Reuven and Rachel say that they're married to each other, I will say that impact, that statement has a ripple effect on many other people, right? His relatives to her relatives to him. So therefore, I will say it's interesting. Hodas baldin kamei edim. If you want to, so to speak, admit, make yourself liable to something, that's fine when the statement only impacts you. But the moment the statement ultimately, again, goes ahead and impacts someone else, we're not going to go ahead and believe it. Incredible. So Marzucha Rav Ada Saba, interesting case. We'll say just a side case over here. Marzucha Rav Ada Saba, Bnei de Rav Mari Bar Isser. Marzucha Bosai and Rav Ada Saba were the sons of Rav Mari. What happens? Rav Mari died. That will say there was an estate to go ahead and split up. So what happens? Palig nechasayu bahadi hadadi. So the two sons, Marzutra and Ravada, divided up the estate. They divided up. Right? Now what happened? This is actually fascinating. Aslu kamed Ravashi. They came before Ravashi. Amrulei, apishnaim edim amrachmana. Now said, here's what happened. They divided up the estate, but there was no edus on their transaction. There was no edus on their transaction. So they come before Ravashi and they said like this. The Torah says, apishne edim yakum davar. Right? Apishnaim edim yakum davar. Right? Ultimately, again, right? Apishne edim or apishlosh edim yakum davar. Torah says, through the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, something is established as fact. So they asked Ravashi, listen to this. Why? What does that mean? So both say, what they're asking was like this. Why do you need eidos on a transaction? Is eidos on a transaction to ensure that no one reneges or no one kind of like tries to lie about what happened? And if that's the case, ultimately, again, we're brothers. We get along fine. We agree to the division. There's no problem. Or maybe transactional reality is only established through testimony. So let's say this is a fascinating shaila. What they were asking Ravashi was, so again, I will say this is actually a beautiful story. 2 brothers who got along, didn't fight over money, divided up their father's estate just fine, and everybody was talking to each other. Then they realized like, oh, do we need witnesses to this transaction? They come before Ravashi, and essentially what they were asking was like this. What is the role of testimony? Is testimony to ensure that no one lies, no one cheats, no one steals, no one reneges? Or is testimony just like a cog in the wheel of creating transactional reality, right? And you need testimony in order to create transactional reality. fasting in Chakira. And so we'll say, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is us, the two brothers. We're good. We're good. We're not going to lie. We're not going to cheat. We're not going to steal. We're not going to renege. So if testimony is to ensure that no one pulls any shtick, we're not going to pull shtick. But if testimony is there to solidify transactional reality, then maybe we need that in order to go ahead and affirm or concretize transactional reality. It's fascinating, no? It's such a fascinating shaila testimony. Is testimony to ensure the integrity of the transaction, that no one lies, or here's what it is. Is testimony there to ensure the integrity of the parties, or is testimony there to ensure the integrity of the transaction? That's their shaila. So Rav Ashi said, Amar lahu, lo ivru sadi ela l'shakri. Listen, so he answered, witnesses were only created for liars. Which is another way of saying, we'll say, testimony is not there for transactional integrity. Testimony is there for personalistic integrity. It is there to ensure the integrity of the parties. Therefore, again, Rav Ashi says to the two brothers, if you guys are good with each other and you don't need edus, your division stands without edus at all. Rabbi say, beautiful. Remember, we still haven't answered our question, which is, what happens, halacha l'maisa, if Reuben is mekadesh Rachel, right? And is eid echad, does that stand by itself? We'll stop over here for today, and Me'at Hashem will answer that tomorrow. Rabbi say, what a daf, shkoyach. We did good. Baruch Hashem.